sorry.
I'm a high compliant person. What? Well, I never got to sneak down to Austin before I left here. Good, good. We are.
Hi, how are you? Good.
Is it 2 o'clock or no?
So the next session starts at 2, so just, all right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna kick you out. Like, it does, right here.
It really is intentional. I mean, they're trying to actively grow that research. And and they hired her
Nick,
and it was there. And yes.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries.
I need you to join the Zoom session, if you don't mind.
Would that just be an email by chance?
If the chair sent out the email with the link, then it should be. If not, Hello, hello. If you're online, can you hear me?
Well, you know, oh, definitely, yeah.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? All right, I think that'll work. Hello, hello.
It's possible there was no one to hear.
We grabbed some original.
Hello, hello. All right, I think that should be good. I think you should be good to go now.
Various little
Perfect.
Thank you both very much.
You're welcome.
Let's give it a listen.
I mean, it's also a fantastic but I'm more
All righty, everybody. Let's get started. Bobbing around on the Zoom up there. We are being supported as a hybrid session. So those who couldn't be here today, either because they left the conference already or had a conflict or are attending remotely instead, may be able to join us as well. And I'm excited for that. And I'm excited to see this many people on the last day of the conference. Thank you all for coming out. I'm happy to say I did my COVID test this morning. I'm free and clear to return to the United States. I hope many of you are in that position as well. So I'm gonna get right to it. I apologize in advance to the authors if either ICA screwed up your name or I do it, but please feel free to correct for the audience what the proper names are. We're just gonna go in the same order as in the book. My name is Mike Schmerbach. I'm the chair for the session, which hopefully means I will read the paper names and nothing more because you all will have excellent questions. And our first paper up is Do Players Seek Meaning or Stumble Upon It? Exploring Fans' Eudaimonic Motivations for Upcoming Games with Daniel Prosler, Rowan Daniels, and Nick Bowman, a name you're gonna hear again, I'm afraid, up first. So take it away, Dan.
Thank you so much. Just a second.
This meeting is being recorded.
Well, and thank you very much for the nice introduction, Mike. My name is Daniel Foster, and we did a study, Rowan Daniels and Nick Bowman and I, on eudaimonic motivations in gaming, because we found a paradoxon. Right, the paradoxon is that we did a review just recently, and we found that there's actually quite a lot of research out there that shows us that games can trigger rich hedonic, but also eudaimonic entertainment responses. So we know that players have eudaimonic feelings related to meaningfulness, related to feeling moved when playing video games. Right, so just to give you a short idea of hedonic and more eudaimonic gaming states might look like. And when we take a look into the motivations literature, we see that a lot has been said and done about video game motivations. And we see that established gaming motivations such as fantasy, competence, exploration, and so on, they can theoretically and empirically rather be associated with enjoyment, so hedonic states, than eudaimonic states. So we see from the literature that people experience these eudaimonic states when playing video games. However, there is no indication right now in the literature that people have eudaimonic motivations and that this makes them turn on their computer or their console or whatever device they play on. So our question was, did we just miss something? That could be the case, right? I mean, also some of the literature on gaming motivations is qualitative, so it should maybe have been found in the literature. it could still be that we were so focused on enjoyment and hedonic states that we just missed it. The other thing might be that players may just not look for eudaimonia when they turn to games. It could be the case that they just stumble upon eudaimonia and thus have those states. For example, take The Witcher 3, right? People may have turned on the computer to slash monsters, to go through epic gaming worlds. But what they then found was quests like the Red Baron, which is much more about empathy and much more gray and not black and white, morally loaded. So it might be that players may just stumble upon eudaimonia, but not explicitly looking for it, but we yet don't know. And to contribute to solve this inconsistency at least a little bit, we thought it would be a good idea to explore eudaimonic reasons for playing digital games. So the question is, how can we operationalize these eudaimonic reasons? And to do so, we turned into the literature, or looked at the literature, and in the general well-being and general psychological literature on orientations, we see that hedonic but also eudaimonic orientations for activities in life in general have been discussed. And eudaimonic orientations, for example, are defined by Hutter and Ryan as seeking to pursue excellence, to use the best in yourselves, to develop a skill, learn, gain insights into something, and to do what you actually believe in. And among other things, research has shown that these orientations also apply to media preferences. So people possess trait-like preferences for more hedonic or more eudaimonic entertainment. For example, Oliver and Rainey understood eudaimonic entertainment preferences as trait-like preferences for entertainment that provides meaning, reflection, is challenging, and has moving experiences. And so we thought, okay, we see that people have general orientations about hedonia and eudaimonia, and they have like trait-like preferences, but do they have situational, so game-related motivations to look into a specific game or to play a specific game for hedonic and eudaimonic reasons? And so we try to develop a scale that measures eudaimonic gaming motivation. And we had three sources for that. The first source was our scoping review I just mentioned at the beginning, where we saw that the literature so far has mostly discussed meaningfulness, being moved, being emotionally challenged, self-reflection, and nostalgia as eudaimonic experiences. And we figured maybe that these experiences are also the reasons why players decide to play a game, because they want to have those experiences. Moreover, there has been literature on self-transcendent emotions, such as awe and elevation, which have also been discussed as states that are highly related to eudaimonia. So we thought maybe these self-transcendent emotions are also eudaimonic reasons why players turn to a game. And then finally, the literature on hedonic and eudaimonic orientations in life in general tells us that eudaimonia might also be about growth, self-realization, and expressing one's identity. All stuff that has not yet been discussed very much when we talk about entertainment. But we think this is primarily because usually the entertainment that has been studied so far, for example, when talking about hedonic and eudaimonic entertainment preferences, was just linear entertainment. So we did just not, there is not the means for growth, for self-realization, for expressing one's identity in the same sense as video games can offer that. And we put up just two references here. I bet most of you are familiar with them, who tell us that especially this expressing one's identity and self-realization growth is something that games can provide. So what we did was we took those well-established gaming motivations that are more related to hedonia than eudaimonia, and we extended this scale by developing some new items that measure eudaimonic gaming motivations. And the question in our study was, what's the dimensionality of this extended scale? And how does the importance differ between different types of games? How do players trait-like hedonic and eudaimonic orientations in life in general, that trait-like entertainment preferences, how do those shape those situational game-related motivations? And finally, how do players' motivations shape their intentions to play? So do players actually want to play a game more if they're more eudaimonically motivated? And in this presentation, I would, because of the limited time, focus on the first and the fourth presentation. I would kindly ask you to take a look into our paper, which we uploaded to the platform if you're interested in our second and third research question. Right. So what we did was we conducted an online survey and we recruited players of yet to be released games, because it was important for us that what we measure is not just post hoc rationalization. So players say, like, oh yeah, I like this game because it does this and that's the reason why I played it. So we wanted players to really think upfront why they want to turn to a game which is not yet released. And we did that with well-established games of well-established franchises. Also, we believe that players have some kind of idea why they want to play a game if the franchise is familiar to them. And you see those games over here. And what we measured was their intention to play, the hedonic gaming motivations, and those were the ones I've just showed you on the slide before. And we used a well-established scale by Charcot and colleagues, because we felt this is a well-tested scale out there, but we very much look forward, for example, to the mob scale to have another basis for such kind of measurement. And then we developed 13 eudaimonic gaming motivation items. And our first research question was, what's the dimensionality of this scale? So we conducted an exploratory and a confirmatory factor analysis by using the split half method. So we did an exploratory factor analysis with half of the data set randomly selected, and then a confirmatory factor analysis with the other half to see if the model holds. And we found 3 factors. And the first factor is actually eudaimonia. So eudaimonia came out as one important factor, and the items that had a very high loading here were that people wanted to grow as a person, reflect on themselves, and experiment with their identity. The second one was a factor which we termed absorption here. It was about experiencing the story of the game and diving into the world and exploring the game world. So it was about diving into the game. And the third one was social interaction. So players wanted to beat their co-players, get to know other players, or conjointly play with others. Then we conducted the confirmatory factor analysis with the second half, and the results hold up. The numbers look okay-ish. And then we just constructed mean indices for the full sample, just to get an idea of how important the different motivations are. And we see here that absorption is by far the most important motivation. It was measured on a scale from 1. This is not a reason why I played this game up to 7. This is the reason why I played this game, or this is very much important to me. Right, and eudaimonia was slightly below the midpoint of the scale, and social interaction was even more below the midpoint of the scale, which isn't very surprising for us because we didn't use that much social games, but rather more single player titles. So then we conducted a regression analysis to see whether those motivations predict players' intention to play the respective games. And we did a block-wise regression, and in the first block we entered the games because of the multi-level structure of our data. And you see that there are some game differences here, but in the sake of time, I'm not discussing them very much here. But let me just come to the second block, which is the eudaimonic and hedonic game preferences, so the trait-like preferences, because we know from prior literature that these trait-like preferences also have an effect on the intention to play. And interestingly, we see here that only the hedonic game preferences exert an effect on the intention to play the respective game. And finally, when we enter our 3 situational motivations, we see that all of them predict the intention to play, but interestingly, only absorption is a positive predictor, while the other 2 are negative predictors of the intention to play the respective games. So what do we make out of that? Well, we think we extended well-established gaming motivations, because the first 2 categories, or the second 2 categories, absorption and social interaction, they mostly mirror what we know from the literature so far, right? We could go into more detail here, and maybe we could add some other hedonic factors. I'm not telling you that on the hedonic side, this is a complete scale, but we see something that we already know from the literature. But we also found that eudaimonia is a stable gaming motivation in its own right. And moreover, we found that eudaimonia might be more than meaning, mixed affect, and reflection, especially in the context of video games. It might also be about self-expression, about identity exploration, and about emotional challenges that you can actively overcome. So the unique characteristics of the medium really kick in here. Interestingly, we found that eudaimonia is a consistent but somehow irrelevant motivational appeal of games. On the one hand, we see that it emerges as one stable factor, and we see that it is important for players. On a scale from 1 to 7, it is on the midpoint of the scale, around the midpoint of the scale. So people don't tell us, no, it's really not that important. But on the other hand, we see that it does not predict players' intention to play the game. And there could be various reasons for that. We think one might be the operationalization. The absorption items were much more concrete. And when you ask players to give their opinion why they want to play a game which has not yet been published, then maybe concreteness is something that predicts just more of this intention. Also, we have fans, we recruited fans of the franchise. So to be honest, there wasn't much variance in their intention. We try to deal with that in the regression analysis. And I'm happy to talk with you about the method we used later, but still, there wasn't much to explain. However, it could also be that players indeed just stumble upon eudaimonia, but not search that. And we want to draw attention here to inspiration, because inspiration has been discussed as an evocative state, something you could not force, but something that has to come over you, the kiss of the muse that has to come over you, metaphorically speaking. And maybe it's a similar thing. You need to have some kind of openness, you have to be in the right mindset, and then eudaimonia can kick in, but you're maybe not like looking for it on purpose. Right, sorry. We of course have some limitations. We validated our factor structure with the split half method, so we did not use a new data set. And we also had a sample of fans, but on the other hand, fans mostly have the best idea why they want to play a game which is not yet released, while players who are not yet familiar to the franchise or have no ideas about the game would be a so great sample here. And also we used established franchises from major publishers, mostly because it was much easier to find players here. But the results might look totally differently when we think about, I don't know, art games or indie games or specific games. Would you turn on not to relax and zoom out or play with friends, but rather because you are open for an experiment or something like that. So it will be very interesting to see if our factor model holds and if we can predict more of the intention to play for those kind of games. We are very much looking forward to your ideas, to your thoughts, and thank you very much for your attention.
So we'll hold questions till the end, in part because I think you'll see that there are some connections among these papers that might lead to more shared questions. So our second paper is covariation among gaming motivations is correlated with anxiety and sociality, a latent class analysis by Nick Bowman and Ching Chang. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. My co-author was unable to attend, unfortunately. For those in Taipei and in Taiwan, there's still a bit tighter restriction getting home. Requires about 21 days of isolation when it's all said and done. She does love us, but maybe not so much. That's okay, I understand. So I'm going to represent our research team, myself and Dr. Sheng, worked at Zhengda, and she's also at Academia Sinica. And this is a data set that if nothing else comes out of this, I want to encourage you to look at the Taiwan Communication Survey. This is a yearly census level media usage survey with incredibly rich data. And as we talk about non-weird sampling and non-North American sampling, it's sitting in a bucket, ready for your plundering towards scientific and social expertise. So I want to very much push that. I also wish to acknowledge our colleagues at the Taiwan Center for Governance Communication Research at Zhengda, as well as Fulbright Taiwan. This was part of my the Wujingji Arts and Culture Fellowship in Zhengda. I would not recommend Fulbright during COVID, but I would recommend Fulbright in any other time you can imagine. I'm happy to talk about that. So our project was looking at this thing called a latent class analysis, which I'll talk about a little bit. And look, in some hand, this data was more proof of concept. So I'm not coming here, I think, with a tablet from the mount. But what I want to talk about is something that I think we all know. There's a motivation to play video games. This is not too surprising. I could wrap this up quickly. We know adolescents play games. They're remarkably popular, but they serve as cultural touchstones. Sociologists have written about, the youngest generation playing. It could be to the point where not having exposure or access to a certain content or product could be detrimental in the sense that you wouldn't be able to fit in with your peers, perhaps. They serve as spaces for cultural interactions. For social interactions. There is a great deal of research. In fact, in the last presentation, and Rowan and our work on eudaimonia, we're finding that people indeed have this social aspect. Those aren't new. And of course, the original games weren't necessarily designed with those things in mind. If you go back to MIT and look in the Cluj room and look at Space War, these were computer scientists before that term existed, just trying to figure out what a machine can do. What can a PDP-1 mainframe do? Can it do more than just run numbers? They built these games that tax the machine's resources and our resources. They provided unique runs every time you use them. I mean, the very idea that I could touch a button and the machine would respond in real time to my touch with something else, which I would touch again, and vice versa, right? Sorry, my time slides are, I think, from the video, so I may be fighting this a little bit. And they were pleasurable to the onlooker. It was neat to watch and eventually play. Scholars, developers worked very hard to try to figure out, okay, there are different games, there are different people. I bet you different people play different games. And so folks like Bartle came up with their player types. And I think Richard would tell you this was not an empirically backed, like loads and loads of ethnographic data. This was, I think there are these players out there and I make games for them. And it was a great start to get us thinking. I think at ICA London, he actually kind of got on to scholars for using his model as like this empirically validated model. He was like, well, it just was a neat idea. Like we were trying to figure this stuff out. But it got us started thinking about people who play for competition versus badges versus talking to others versus just wandering around the environment. I am the best fisherman in Azeroth. I can tell you this. I'm very, very, very good at fishing in Azeroth. That is all. And then we saw folks like Nick Yi and John Sherry and his team in the mid-2000s adopting the uses and gratifications model, this idea of active, functional, seeking out purposely the use of games to satisfy, challenged gratifications, socializing gratifications. There's a lot of crossover in their two lists. I think you've seen Nick Yi's work in recent years as he's gone to Quantic Foundry and gone a little more commercial with the research, has broken those original categories into kind of subcategories. But my beef with is that we tend to talk about them like they're discrete. And it's always been a little strange to me. And even in analyses, we run them in the regression model and they're one-to-one. This motivation predicted X and this motivation predicted X. But if you look even at Yi's later models, they're dimensional, right? You see some crossover in co-motivation or co-variation in the motivations. And essentially, that's what we wanted to understand, is this co-variation, does it exist? So with that, what does it co-vary with? And again, we're a bit constrained by the nature of our data collection, but some of the measures in the Taiwan Communication Survey include measures of anxiety, self-reports of anxiety, and also measures of connectedness and conformity needs, whether it's being bonded to other people or wanting to fit in and belong in social situations. And whenever you're looking at class analyses, you can't just say these things cluster. It's these things cluster, and they might cluster in meaningful ways with something else. And these are the variables we have available to us. So that's what we investigated. Will there be reliable consistent cluster. Should not say clustering. Class analysis is very different than cluster analysis. Someone's going to throw something at me. Different classes, and will those classes meaningfully covary with some of these outcome measures? I'm really sorry about the bouncing back and forth. As I've already said, we used about, what was it, 1,600 or so Taiwanese high school students, junior and senior year, 14, 15 years old. This is quota. I mean, this is representative data. It is day 5 of a conference, isn't it? They did play about 9 hours a week, but the median was about 3 hours a week. Okay, so good data. And again, I could talk to you all day about the Taiwan. Look how happy they are filling it out. It's great data. But sincerely, I can talk to you about this data set. So the first thing we wanted to see was the covariation. And we did find 4 unique classes. So latent class analysis is very similar to exploratory factor analysis, but for categorical data. And it's going to present to you classes being co-motivations. So one that we saw were social. So what you see on this chart, it's a little hard to see. As you go up the y-axis, it's the proportion of people in that class picking that motivation. And then the motivations are listed below. The data gave you a yes, no. Do you play games for this reason? Do you play games for this reason? Do you play games for this reason? And what you saw were that the role players were the ones, for example, if you look closely at here, they would talk about playing a different role. They would talk about creating a game character, but notice how all the other scores in that yellow group are pretty low. If you look at the social gamers, right, they're the folks that are like, they're over here. I'm trying to track them down for you. They would score high on interaction. They would score high on opportunities to team up. The other ones were low. The one group were just the fun seekers. Everything else was a no, except just, I want to have fun, exciting games. And then a limitation sometimes to latent class analysis is you almost always find this maximizer group. And they're just people who check yes on all of it. And we're not always sure what to do with those folks, but you see it even in other completely separate domains of media use. You have maximizers. It may not be totally surprising because media are quite diverse and there could just be people who like to play. Here's what's cool though. Across these groups, they all play the same amount per week. That I thought was really neat. So you have the person who just plays for fun, and the person who just plays for role playing, and the person who only plays for everything versus the competition person. They all play 9 hours a week with a median score of 3. That's pretty wild. So it's suggesting that there's not. I would have expected some covariation in that number, and it was not there. Then we looked at just as a validation, because I have ranted in other presentations about why genres are kind of a weird broken construct. However, we measure genres and the data. Role players play simulation games. They play role-playing games. They play music games, but we noticed the games in our sample tended to be the games like Rock Band, where you took on a persona. The social gamers played a racing sports first-person shooter. You would not think that's social, but they were mobile-based. And so you saw that making sense. I'm so sorry. The fun seekers didn't show a strong preference for any genre, and the maximizers showed high preferences for all the genres. So some validation that these 4 classes do have some, convergent validity with something else, right? Then with anxiety and these other ones. So anxiety was highest with maximizers and with role players. This could be a mood management process or withdrawal process. We don't know. This is very basic data, but this is always the limitation of large data, is that it's a little harder to get into the nuance. So I'm hoping this presentation might spark some additional data collections. Social connectedness was higher. When we looked at social conformity, it was highest for maximizers and social gamers. So again, that would make sense. They're gaming to engage and interact with people. So, and the one thing that we think could be happening in this data, and this is speculative, okay? It could be a situation that this initial anxiety trigger might just cause you to look towards satisfaction versus escapism. And there's some theoretical reasons to believe both those things could exist, a mood management or an escape process. And then it could be, okay, once you've initially been nudged towards gaming as a selection, are you looking to hang out with people or not? And if you are, you're a social gamer. And if you're not, you might be a fun seeker. Because the fun seeker is maybe just gaming for rote satisfaction independent of folks. Whereas down below, maybe you're anxious and you want to escape, and then in that escape, you might look for a role because you're not feeling social, but you are feeling anxious. This is not what our data says. We found a bunch of things that circulate around this potential model, and I think it's something we could do once we identify latent classes. We can start seeing how other types of motivations might nudge somebody into a class, okay? Please reach out to both of us. We're still actively working on this data set and on this manuscript. It has some holes and it has some limitations, but I think it's helping us. If nothing else, think about co-motivations and think about why they might reliably matter for the gaming experience, okay? So thank you for having me, and I'll be here to answer questions, okay?
Thank you, Nick. So next up, we have so far yet so near presence and psychological distance on pro-social behavior in virtual reality. Hugh-Man Lee, Benjamin Lee, Yao Feng Ah, Samuel Weng Leong Lim, and Wen Pen Go, all from Nanyang.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Hui Min, and I'm a current master's student at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information in Singapore. And well, this paper doesn't have Prof. Nick Bowman's name on it, so it's going to be kind of different. And on behalf of my co-authors today, I'm excited to present to you this paper that we did for our undergraduate final year thesis titled So Far Yet So Near. Oops. So to give a brief background of our project, we noticed this trend of using immersive mediums such as VR or 360-degree videos for social good to encourage empathy and pro-social behavior, for example, increasing donation intentions for a particular social cause. And in this line of research, we often talk about how immersive mediums can create a psychological sense of being there, also known as presence. And the idea behind immersive mediums is that it can allow you to be so immersed in it that you vividly and viscerally experience any situation from any perspective. And this makes it an effective medium to develop empathy. But beyond that, however, the link between immersion, empathy, and especially pro-social behavior still remains quite unclear. So this is what our study sought to do. The construct level theory proposes that individuals experience the world in varying degrees of psychological distance, and they specify 4 types of psychological distance in particular: spatial, social, temporal, and hypothetical. Because we were kind of bounded by the materials for our study, we decided to focus on only 2 types of distance: spatial distance, which refers to how near or far one feels from a geographical location, and social distance, which refers to how close or distant one feels from another person. So to kind of sum up, our study is focused on exploring the link between presence and psychological distance and how this might have carryover effects to empathy and pro-social behavior. And we are basically asking the question of whether immersion in an immersive environment can prompt people to believe that they themselves are in a real environment, experiencing something real, and therefore feel psychologically closer to it. So going back to the idea of presence, I think I just want to point out that this definition of presence that we've taken from Lee talks about presence as a psychological state in which the virtuality of the experience is unnoticed. And Lee in particular proposes that presence can be segregated into 3 types, but we focus on physical presence, which is when virtual physical objects or environments are experienced as actual physical objects or environments, and self-presence, which is when virtual selves are experienced as actual selves. So to apply presence and psychological distance, we propose 2 serial mediation routes, which for simplicity's sake, I will term the place illusion route and the self-plausibility route. And I will go more in-depth into each of them later, but we have separated the different types of presence and the different types of psychological distance to see what possible effects, mediation effects they might have on empathy and pro-social behavior. And just a point to note that we are not actually trying to compare or saying that they cannot occur simultaneously, but we're just trying to see the associations and how this might work out. So for the first route, the place illusion route, the focus of this route is really on the perception of the environment that one is immersed in. So we are proposing that a virtual environment that feels real should be perceived as spatially closer to oneself. So for example, if you are in a virtual forest and you hear the sounds of the river flowing, or you hear the sounds of birds chirping, you're more likely to feel that it may be a real environment and experience a sense of physical presence. And from there, you might perceive that you are spatially closer to this place that feels real. So what effects would this then have on empathy and prosocial behavior? For the second route, which is the self-plausibility route, this route, unlike the first route's focus on the environment, is really more focused on one's perception of oneself in the environment that they are immersed in. So we're proposing that a virtual self that feels like one's real self, so when you experience self-presence, should be perceived as socially closer to oneself. So in a previous study, when participants were placed in a virtual prison, they reported feeling distressed, and so they possibly experienced self-presence, and from there they felt socially closer and felt more similar to, for example, the prison inmates. And this helped them to foster empathy towards those individuals. Now, moving on to our study design, as I said, we were kind of constrained by the materials that we have because we used a serious game that was developed by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And in this game, it was meant for VR actually. And it was a series of 2 experiences, the first of which participants were immersed in a war zone and they had to try and get out, and they were also like experiencing like the military crossfire, and they had to bring a child to a medevac location. Then in the second experience, they were placed in a village where there was a hidden minefield, and they suffered from the effects of an explosion, as you can see in the last picture. So for our sample, we had 244 participants with a mean age of 23 years old, and they were all, the gender breakdown was quite equal. To manipulate the levels of immersion, as I said, we were given the immersive VR experience first. So this included the headset and the handheld controllers. So we created a moderate and low immersion condition respectively as well, which used the 360-degree video in the headset only without the handheld controllers, and the 360-degree video on desktop. So we kind of manipulated immersion through modality. We used 2 outcome variables for each route to measure pro-social behavior. So we measured both intention to volunteer and intention to donate, and to test the serial mediation route, we used the process macro. Before doing all this, we also ran a manipulation check to verify that the VR condition had the highest level of immersion compared to the other 2, and that was significant. So for our results, we actually found support for the place illusion route. As you can see, there was a significant indirect effect for both the intention to volunteer and intention to donate, and all the coefficients that we had predicted were in the correct direction as well, and they were significant. So what we kind of concluded from this was that when an immersive environment can allow you to feel a sense of physical presence and feel that it is a real environment, you're more likely to feel that you can feel that it is spatially closer to you, and this can actually help in developing feelings of empathy and affecting behavioral intentions later on. Now, for our self-plausibility route, however, we did not actually find a significant mediation effect. And as you can see, there was a non-significant relationship between social distance and empathy. So that led to the serial mediation routes for both intention to volunteer and intention to donate being non-significant. So what we did was, we found this a bit weird. We tested a simplified route where we just removed social distance. And here we see the simplified self-plausibility route, where the relationship from immersion to self-presence, empathy, and pro-social behavior was found to be significant. So this means that an immersive environment that can help people to feel a sense of self-presence is still relatively important in helping to encourage feelings of empathy that leads to behavioral intentions to act on that feelings later on. So we were kind of confused why social distance was not a mediator of this relationship, and some literature suggests that there might be possible conflicting effects of social distance. For example, people who feel more psychologically distant instead of close might actually have more abstract thoughts and be more generous in terms of their donations. Or, for example, because we tested willingness to donate to an organization, this might actually be higher when people feel socially distant from the organization as opposed to feeling socially close to an individual. To give a brief summary of our study now, what we did was to use the construct level theory and in particular psychological distance to understand how immersive mediums can be effective in encouraging empathy and pro-social behavior. And we also tried to look at different aspects of presence and psychological distance to help us understand this. So what we found is that immersive mediums can help to reduce various forms of psychological distance, and this might have benefits in terms of encouraging affective and also behavioral responses. There's also the value of immersive environments that can facilitate the perception of plausible real environments and real selves. And this is something to take note of and has consequences for example, immersive games, storytelling, and also journalism in particular, where empathy is often a key goal of such experiences. Yeah. This is my very last slide. To further note that also we want to acknowledge that we understand that there is definitely a more complex relationship between the different aspects of presence and psychological distance. And what we tested was merely a starting point to see what the possible effects are. So this is something that future studies might want to consider as well. And we also, in our virtual environment, it was quite a negatively valenced environment. So something that future studies can do is to also look at more positive environments to see whether such effects might be stronger or might hold up. Lastly, another limitation of our study is that we only measured is the measurement of intention to donate and volunteer. So I would suggest that maybe in future we could measure actual behavior or longer term intentions to truly see the value of such immersive mediums when applied for practical users. Yeah, with that, this is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to our fourth and final paper of the session, Moral Decisions in Video Games and Players' Intergroup Attitudes, Wei Ji, Dominic Keck, Vivian Chen, and Nicholas Bowman.
Okay, very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dominic. I'm a PhD student from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And together with Dr. Vivian Chen and Dr. Nick, who's here, we'll be presenting our study, which is on moral decisions in video games and players' intergroup attitudes. So in this study, we'll be looking at intergroup bias, and in particular, we'll be looking at people's attitudes towards immigrants. And this is an issue that has been ongoing for many years. We see a lot of issues, a lot of problems about xenophobia, and along with the COVID-19 pandemic, it has kind of exacerbated. So we have to often think about ways in which we can use digital technologies, how we can use video games to actually improve people's intergroup attitudes. Fortunately, for video games, there seems to be some hope in terms of reducing prejudice and also increasing people's empathy towards outgroup members. So in past literature, we've actually seen some results So in this particular study, we'll be looking at how we can actually engage players in moral decisions and how does that actually influence their intergroup attitudes towards immigrants. So some literature actually do suggest that by engaging players in moral choices, by making them do think about certain morality, moral situations, it can actually increase the meaningful entertainment experiences, which has been kind of mentioned earlier, the eudaimonic experiences. And those eudaimonic experiences can actually arguably increase one's concerns towards the well-being of others. And there are also some arguments about how whenever we make in video games, sometimes we do certain immoral things, certain immoral actions that we might not actually do in our everyday lives. And those actions might actually prompt us to actually reflect upon them. And it could also elicit feelings of guilt, which may not necessarily be a bad thing. And that could actually shift one's perceptions towards the out-group members that they might actually interact in the virtual environment. So with that, we actually hypothesized that players will actually play a moral video game involving characters whose nationalities were actually presented in the game would actually have more positive post-game attitudes towards immigrants as compared to those who actually play a similar game but are not exposed to any moral scenarios. And because also for context, we actually designed a video game for this study. And in order to look at how a video game is able to shift people's intergroup perceptions, we do need to have characters, game characters of different nationalities, different identities. So what we did was to manipulate 3 conditions. We had the first condition was a condition where players actually interacted with all citizen characters only. The second condition, if you were to play this version of the video game, you would be interacting with all foreigner characters. And in the third condition, there would be a mix of both citizen and foreigner characters, which kind of like the condition that we were actually really interested in, because this kind of resembles our everyday life interactions where we do have people of different identities, different cultural backgrounds interacting with one another. And with that, we actually draw upon the social identity theory, which suggests that when there are certain things that can actually prompt social comparisons, it can actually lead to intergroup distinctions, and it can somehow encourage discrimination. So we do actually hypothesize that players who actually interact with the mix with both the citizens as well as the foreigners in the game condition would actually have more negative post-game attitudes towards immigrants as compared to those who actually interacted with only the citizen or only the foreigner characters in the video game. So this is the kind of the 2 main manipulations that we're actually looking at. It's a 3x2 study, and we're also interested to know whether there will be any interaction effects in terms of how the content of the video game, whether it's a moral game, whether it's a neutral game, does it interact with the nationality, the identities of the NPCs in the game, and how does that actually influence people's attitudes towards immigrants. And after getting to know whether playing a moral game is actually effective in terms of shifting intergroup perceptions, we're kind of curious also. So what are some of the what are some of the mechanisms that are involved in terms of how morality, how making moral choices can actually change people's intergroup perception? So this is what we're actually looking at. We'll be looking at how people's moral foundations actually can influence their moral decisions, and whether this would be mediated by guilt to influence their attitudes towards immigrants. So here we draw upon the moral foundations theory, which essentially suggests that there are about 6 moral foundations within us humans, and in different scenarios, in different situations, we do draw upon the moral foundations that we have to make decisions. So essentially, if a moral foundation is salient to you, let's say if I were to encounter a situation where I have to decide whether I would like to help an injured person, if my care foundation is actually pretty high, it's pretty salient, that's when I would actually choose to uphold that foundation, and I would choose to actually help the person that's in need in that situation. So with that, we are also interested to see whether the 6 different moral foundations, how do they actually influence players' game decisions in this particular study. Next, we look at guilt. So whenever we make decisions in video games, we do experience some emotions, and some studies have actually found that people who engage in immoral actions in video games do experience higher levels of guilt. And so we actually do hypothesize that people who actually play the moral video game would actually experience higher levels of guilt as compared to those who played a similar game without the moral scenarios. And it is also possible that there would be a positive relationship between the violation of the respective moral foundations and players' feelings of guilt. Ultimately, this is what we are interested to look at, whether guilt actually influences, whether does it actually improve people's intergroup attitudes, because some literature actually have suggested that when people experience feelings of guilt, they tend to make fewer stereotypic comments, fewer negative responses towards outgroup members, and they actually also do show greater support. And also there are some arguments about how guilt can actually motivate people to behave morally. So with that, we do hypothesize that players who actually experience higher levels of guilt would have more positive post-game attitudes towards immigrants, and guilt might potentially be a mediator between players' game decisions and their attitudes. So this is the main manipulation which I've gone through earlier. And essentially it was an online study. So we conducted a pre and post test. Before playing the game, players actually filled in a questionnaire to measure their attitudes and some of their moral foundations. And then they played the video game for about 20 minutes. And finally, after the video game, they completed another questionnaire to measure the variables that we were interested to examine. So this study was conducted in Singapore. We had about 300, we did have 300 participants, and each condition had about 50 participants. So there were 6 conditions, and they were mostly Singapore citizens. So let me introduce to you this video game. So I wanted to show a video, but I think due to time constraints, I'll just describe what this video game is about. So we actually did create this video game from scratch. It was a pretty tedious process, but that hopefully turned out fine. So essentially this game was a management game. So players took on the role as a manager where they had to hire the different workers. And one of our manipulations was to actually look at the character's identity. So during the hiring phase, players would be presented with a passport of the workers that they actually hired. So that's when they can actually see the nationality of the workers. And along the way, during the whole simulation, there would also be, if you were to play the moral version of the video game, you would experience the various moral scenarios that were written based on the moral foundations, the 6 different moral foundations. And after making those decisions, players actually do get to see what are some of the consequences of the actions from the gameplay. So that was our way to kind of also elicit feelings of guilt from that gameplay. And these are some of our measures. I'll just quickly go through attitudes towards immigrants, moral foundations, guilt, and we also did code what were some of the moral decisions that they made, whether they uphold, did they uphold the moral foundations? Did they uphold the foundation or did they violate the foundations? And these are the descriptive statistics, but I think we are more interested to see the main effects of the study. So essentially, we did find that there was a significant main effect on the NPC's nationality. So we did a post hoc analysis, and what we found was that participants who were in the mixed condition, they actually did report a lower post-game attitude score as compared to those in the all citizens condition. However, there were no significant differences in terms of the mixed conditions, the people in the mixed condition attitudes as compared to the people who were in the all foreigners condition. So our first hypothesis was kind of partially supported. However, we did not find any effects for the content type, which was the moral and neutral content. We did not actually find any main effects there, and there were no interaction effects. However, if we were to dive deeper into the results, what we found was that players who actually played the moral game, in general, they did experience a significantly higher level of guilt as compared to those who played the moral game version. So we also did a path analysis using M+ in order to further understand, so what actually did happen along the way as players were playing the game. And this is what we actually found. So in terms of the relationship between moral foundations and players' decisions, we did not find significant results across all the 6 moral foundations, but instead we only found significant results in terms of care, fairness, and the authority foundations on players' decisions. So for those foundations, if they were salient, players were more likely to uphold those foundations in the game. And as for the relationship between moral decisions and guilt, this is where we also kind of like see a lack of significant findings. We only did see that for those who violated the care and harm foundation, people actually experience higher levels of guilt. So you might be thinking, so did guilt actually influence post-game attitudes? Unfortunately, we did not find any results in terms of the relationship between guilt and post-game attitudes, which we'll cover in the discussion section. So overall, what was pretty interesting was that we did actually find some results in terms of how the characters' identities would actually influence intergroup attitudes. So especially for those who played the mixed condition where you have both citizens and foreigner characters, they actually experienced poorer intergroup attitudes. So this is something that game developers potentially has to take note of if you were to create a video game to improve intergroup attitudes, like maybe having such comparisons might actually not be in favor of you. And next, what we found was that the relationship between trait moral foundations and game decisions, there were no significant relationships across all 6 moral foundations and the decisions, but this might be also due to how certain foundations itself might not be as important, might not be seen as important to some players. So that's where we might not actually have seen any results. But the results were still somewhat encouraging because we did see like some of almost half of the foundations were actually associated with the game decisions. And finally, for this, the lack of significant results in terms of guilt on post attitudes, we did actually reflect on that finding, and we realized that, so actually for the scenarios, the moral scenarios that we actually manipulated, the ones that we actually created, they were kind of mirroring certain scenarios that might happen in our everyday lives. So as compared to shooter games where you might actually, really harm a person, so something that is really a lot more consequential. Whereas for the scenarios that we created, they were somewhat less consequential, and they were kind of like mirroring microaggressions. So those situations might not have been strong enough to really create a change in players' attitudes and players' perceptions. So something that we are looking at is to potentially explore how maybe we could create more consequential scenarios and to see whether there would be stronger effects and whether there would be better results. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to let us know during the Q&A. Thank you.
That does leave us about 15 minutes for questions. So go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions for the group.
I have a question for Daniel. You presented these, you interviewed these games to real participants, asked them their attention to play them, right? Yes. But did you also assess how meaningful or how satisfying your participants would rate these games to be, because that could have influenced the results of your regression analysis?
Yeah, most definitely. No, we have not done that. So we have not asked them how much they felt this game would be a more meaning focused or a more pleasure focused game. And what we did was we tried to find games that are across the board. So some games that should, considering the past literature, are more focused on pleasure, and others that should be more focused on eudaimonic experiences or franchises which were found or known to evoke strong eudaimonic responses. But you're absolutely right. That would be a great idea to measure this. We unfortunately haven't measured it in this study, but it would be great to do so and to have a weight there to see whether it fits with their perception. Makes great sense.
Hi, thank you all for wonderful presentations. I have a lot of thoughts on on each of them. I wanted to start by asking about presence and empathy, in part because I worked on a similar study a couple of years ago with a different theoretical foundation, but that also sort of looked at this pathway between presence and empathy. And I was wondering if you considered looking at empathy as more of a multidimensional construct, and in particular, whether separating out sort of aspects of cognitive and affective empathy might be one way of accounting for the non-significant relationship between social distance and empathy that you mentioned as part of that second pathway.
I think for our study, we measured empathy using both cognitive and affective aspects, but we didn't actually separate the two in our analysis. So that's something that we actually never thought of before. So I think that's very worth looking at as well. And maybe to add on to that point, another way that people have conceptualized empathy is also to look at sometimes higher empathy can lead to higher personal distress as well. So I think that could be another possible reason for this conflicting effects or this lack of significant relationship. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you all for your really wonderful presentations. Really inspiring session. I have a question for Dominic. First of all, are you planning to publish your study somewhere? I will be really interested in seeing that. And second, could you maybe elaborate more on the different scenarios on the moral foundation review? I think you mentioned the third one, and maybe just give a few more examples how you operationalize all the other 5 ones. And I think it's really cool that you took all the 6. Usually people just take the 5, so congratulations on also improving everything in the session. And I'm happy to hear how the other scenarios look like.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We're actually kind of working on getting this paper published. So yeah, we just finished the study last year, so we're just kind of refining and wanted to get more comments in terms of how we can actually improve on this. As for the scenarios, like the authority scenario, okay, I need to kind of refresh my memory because it's been quite a bit of quite some time. But I think for that scenario, so all the scenarios we actually did a manipulation check. So like we gave them a rating whereby they actually rated like, so how much do you feel about like, does this like, do you feel like someone is actually being harmed? Do you think like someone of authority is being gone against? So we did a manipulation check, and for all the scenarios, all the moral scenarios, we actually did find significant differences in terms of the results compared to the other moral foundations that were not of interest. So for the authority scenario, I think it was like this particular officer who actually came to the store and wanted the worker to actually pay for something, and then the worker kind of like had some issues, and so the players themselves, as a manager, you have to kind of like decide whether should your worker actually pay for this particular fee. Yeah, it was something like that.
Like a mall management fee, just
Yeah.
pay you over the stall fee right now.
Yeah.
Or like for harm, it was there was like a mess or a pile, and the employee had to go pick it up. He was like, I can't, I hurt my back. If you make me pick this up, I'm gonna hurt myself. Wasn't there one, Dominic, where somebody cut the line? Like, I'm an important customer here. You have to feed me or else. And then the employee's like, what do I do? And so every time they would turn to you as the manager and say, what do I do? But I think that was always like, I'm an important customer. You have to serve me first. And the customer would literally like walk in front of the line and push out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, did we put the scenarios on OSF maybe?
I don't think so.
Really great.
I know we have them for sure. You
Yeah.
email us.
I didn't share the link
Please
with
do.
you for the game.
Yeah. And I think we even have that pre-test validation data. And Dominic was able to do the hard thing in the NFB work, to show the one salience and the other one's being low.
Yeah.
Mostly it's mixed.
Yeah. Email us for sure. I know for a fact we have that addendum. somewhere.
This is not
I think I may have barked about it a couple of times.
Thank you so much.
I have a question for Daniel. Actually. So, I know one of the things that you said in your paper was that it's a possibility that they stumble on experiences rather than seek them. I wonder if it's in your plans to maybe do, since a lot of these games are still unreleased, like a sort of a pre-post release versus their expectations versus what they actually experienced, and to see if this is true. And also, I think the second thing that I was thinking of is in AAA titles, it might also be possible that the level of salience they attribute to things like graphics and soundtracks just kind of overshadow the more eudaimonic aspects of it as well. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. All right. Let me answer your first question with the post measure, and then just Nick told me because we also had a qualitative measurement. So the second question I will refer to my co-author, which is quite handy when you are in the co panel. Yeah. All right. So your first question: do we plan to do a post measurement? Yeah. We collected the email addresses of everyone who participated in our study. We asked them whether they are willing to participate in a second study, and we would love to do this second study. It really depends on the timing of when the games are released. I think some of the games already have been released, but those were also not the games where we had the most players on. I guess when Mass Effect comes out or when Zelda comes out, that would be very interesting to see. Also, it would be very interesting just to ask them again, even though the game is not released, because more and more information are coming out, and we could see how stable those motivations are, not just in terms of factors, but also in terms of, do people's motivations actually shift in their pre-release phase? That would also be very interesting to see.
Yeah, and to comment very briefly on the second one, it's under review still, but we did find some of this, and it was connected to the paradex. So, for example, Final Fantasy 15, right?
Yeah,
15. A lot of players talked. So, what they would ask to do to elaborate on their answers in the survey, and they talked for Final Fantasy 15 about aesthetics, about the music, about the score, about the developer. But if you go and read the coverage of Final Fantasy 15, it's almost all about the development, right? So we did see some nuance in what they were talking about. But even in the qualitative results, even in the thematic analyses, which were an inductive analysis method, we didn't see a strong eudaimonic focus. And that was again surprising. And if you, I think I can share some of those data. Yeah, send me an email and I can get you those. But what you'll see is, yes, but they didn't necessarily connect it back to eudaimonia. And so what we're seeing is a pattern across these two studies and then other data analyses where we absolutely know eudaimonia exists in gaming, but we're not seeing great evidence that people are highly aware of it. And that's why I'm very much intrigued by this inspiration concept that it kisses you on the head. So, but I'm happy to share those things with you. I do say it both ways, because I'm not convinced it's the right way to say eudaimonia.
Thanks to all of the presenters, really great presentations. This goes again out to Daniel. So in this, because this is like more or less the end of the ICA, I take the role of the devil's advocate. So
please go ahead.
Okay. Serious. Okay, so the question here is, now I'm a game producer. Okay. So and my question, Daniel, would be that the outcome of your study would more or less be that game users dare to be surprised. Okay, so they're looking for entertainment, and maybe they dare to be surprised. So why should I invest into these game designers that suggest we need some eudaimonia, we need some meaningful things, when people are just looking for entertainment? Can you please tell me why this is important?
Well, yeah, of course. Thank you very much for playing the devil's advocate here. Also, one first thing, this is not the end of the conference. There are more presentations coming, very interesting ones indeed. This the first things first. But the second thing is, well, right. And maybe for a developer, you're interested in selling your game. And if you're interested in selling your game, it is of course important to satisfy players' anticipated needs, their motivations, why they turn to games. So from that perspective, I would definitely agree with you. Don't invest any energy in eudaimonia because that's not what players, at least not for the games we studied, are looking for. However, when we look at the literature on eudaimonic experiences, we see that they value them a lot. So even though they may not seek them, when they stumble upon them, they value them a lot. And I would even have the hypothesis that this is what players remember the most when they think back to the game. This is like the most memorable thing, something that really sticks with them. And so in terms of what makes their entertainment value, I think we have to just separate that from what drives them to buy this game. Right. And also maybe there is, again, it is the usual problem with a case study. Maybe if we would have picked like The Last of Us 3 or something, then maybe we would have found something there. Even though we believe that the games we picked were those which were found in a lot of prior studies as games that evoke eudaimonic responses. So, right, I would say that's the difference between anticipation and between real outcome.
And incidentally, also when we opened the data, people were very good at recalling the prior franchises, but they were very vague with what they expected out of the new game. And so maybe the only exception was lore. There were people who talked a lot about Mass Effect 6. It's going to sew up the lore. And they would be a little more specific when they were talking about in-game characters. But if I'm recalling deeply, they were so specific about what made them feel special, but they did not say something very specific about the next game. And so that was even more interesting because I would have thought they would have carried it over. They knew it could happen, but that still wasn't a motivating factor. They would say something like, and then they would give deep idiosyncratic stories of eudaimonia, but yet their second half of their answer would be, and I'm looking forward to Zelda. I'm like, what? So, and I guess I'm curious to see if and how this plays over in film as well, and other genres where, like, we know the capacity is there. So, but I like your note about that. It does stick with people. And even in these surveys, it stuck with people. And they would talk about, these deep idiosyncratic eudaimonic experiences. They were vague on the one they were expecting. Maybe it's the mystery. Maybe it is a surprise. They know they'll feel something. They just don't know what's going to be yet.
I think we have a very quick follow-up and then that will have to go.
Sorry, I'm loud, but maybe it's a factor of good storytelling. I didn't plan to cry 7 times when I went to Endgame. I went for fun, and it was not trailered on anything that emotionally set me off. So, and those things were personal to me. My 16, 17-year-old thought I was maybe a little crazy, but that's what it's about. Isn't it about good storytelling? And so you maybe don't go get it, but like you say, I think you're describing it very well. It's what you remember. That's what you remember. You remember when it really took you to another place, because that was another place. It wasn't just action. That's what separates Marvel movies from DC. That's what separates Marvel movies, because they run the gamut of emotional input from total hedonism to, bawling your eyes out. So,
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. Just one very, very short comment on that. To be a devil's advocate in our own study, also it raises the question for me how active and reflective people are about their motivations. I mean, that's something we discuss in the user gratification literature for years now. Do people say, like, I want to play this game because it will be great, but can they really disentangle what great and entertaining means? Or is it just like, I can tell you what the last game was great, and I expect something great from this game as well. So that's also something, especially in the qualitative data, because then you would expect people to, give them their accounts and not like not like pressing it into our answer categories.
Absolutely. And the little caveat is, it may well be the case that in the absence of an equal elaboration, it does have to happen. Like there has to be the trigger, the switch, the experience itself. That was in the scoping review, right?
Yeah.
And it may just be either, it may just be too difficult, or we're just not motivated enough to think about what is it I expect about. And that's why, again, the lore NPC one, that kind of made sense, is they had a focal object. I expect character X to resolve in situation Y. But outside of that, it was just, I know I'm gonna feel something. You know?
Yeah, I think, thank you, everyone. And I'm sure folks probably maybe have more questions. And I hope the authors will sort of linger and allow folks to come up and ask their questions, but we are at time. I did also want to add, I think that last point about sort of why, so motivations maybe are driving purchase, maybe brand loyalty is driving purchase in a way that their prior experience of Unimania is what that. But I also think there is an unanswered question in those two papers that, Nick doesn't care because he just cares about the psychology of it, but I care about the mass comm and society part of my journal, right? So the sort of like, so they're motivated for these things, so what, right? I think that's a really interesting question as well. Like, they're motivated to continue the story. What is that going to do when they encounter the game? Does their absence of eudaimonic motivation actually preclude them from experiencing eudaimonia? Does it change how they interact with the game? We don't know, but I think that's a really important part of what you might be asking there as well. Even if they are ignorant of what they're getting out of it, does it change their ability to get something out of it, to have these pro-social experiences? So thank you, everyone, for coming at this late, but not, we are told, very final session. And in particular, thank you to all of our authors.
Colleagues, these are both undergraduate projects. I just want to reflect on that for a moment. Like, that's pretty impressive. Like, yeah.
The recording has stopped.